United States, 1980. Part 1. A Life of Struggles. The morning sun filtered weakly through the cracked blinds of Miguel's tiny apartment, casting long shadows across the worn-out furniture that filled the cramped space. The room, like much of Miguel's life, was a reflection of his circumstances. Frugal and bare, with only the essentials to get by. The peeling paint on the walls spoke of years of neglect, and the faint hum of the city outside served as a constant reminder of the world's indifference. But despite the worn surroundings, Miguel greeted each day with a quiet resilience, his spirit unbroken by the hardships he faced. Miguel had grown up in the heart of Los Angeles, a city where dreams were often crushed under the weight of reality. His childhood had been marked by scarcity of money, of opportunity, and often of hope. He was the son of immigrants who had come to America with the promise of a better life, but who had found themselves ensnared in a cycle of poverty from which they could never quite escape. His father, a man of few words and many burdens, had worked himself to the bone, taking on any job he could find just to keep food on the table. His mother, equally weary, had done her best to hold the family together, but the strain was evident in the lines etched deeply into her face. By the time Miguel was old enough to fend for himself, he had already learned that life was a struggle, a constant fight to survive in a world that offered little in return. School had been a luxury he couldn't afford, and he had dropped out at an early age to help support his family. His days were filled with back-breaking labor, construction work, carpentry, janitorial duties, waiting tables, whatever he could find. His hands, once soft and unmarked, had become calloused and rough, the skin toughened by years of handling bricks, wood, and cleaning supplies. Yet, despite the grueling work, Miguel never complained. He accepted his lot with a quiet dignity, his heart rooted in a deep-seated belief that there was more to life than what he had known. There were nights, though, when the weight of it all threatened to crush him. On those nights, Miguel would lie awake on the threadbare mattress that served as his bed, staring up at the water-stained ceiling, and wonder if things would ever change. He had no illusions about his place in the world. He was just another face in the crowd, another cog in the machine. But even in his darkest moments, there was a flicker of something within him, a small, persistent flame that refused to be extinguished. Miguel had always been a solitary figure, not by choice, but by circumstance. The harsh realities of his upbringing had left little room for friendships or close connections. Most of the people he encountered were either too busy with their own struggles or too jaded to care about anyone else's. Yet, despite his isolation, Miguel harbored a deep-seated kindness, a compassion that belied his rough exterior. He was the type of person who would give his last dollar to someone in need, who would lend a helping hand without expecting anything in return. It was this inherent goodness that set him apart, even if he didn't realize it himself. One day, after finishing a long shift at a local construction site, Miguel walked through the familiar streets of his neighborhood. The sun was setting, casting an orange hue over the city, and the air was thick with the smell of exhaust and street food. Miguel's steps were heavy with fatigue, but his mind was already drifting to thoughts of tomorrow, of another day of hard work and the endless cycle of survival. As he passed by a dimly lit alleyway, a sound caught his attention, a scuffle, followed by a low, menacing voice. Instinctively, Miguel stopped and peered into the darkness, his senses on high alert. What he saw made his blood run cold. An elderly man, hunched and frail, was being cornered by four younger men, their faces twisted with malice. They were armed with knives, their blades gleaming in the faint light as they demanded the old man's money. Miguel's heart raced as he watched the scene unfold. Every instinct in him screamed to walk away, to keep his head down and avoid getting involved. But something deeper, something primal, stirred within him, a sense of righteousness, of an unwillingness to stand by while an innocent person was harmed. Without fully understanding why, Miguel found himself moving towards the group, his footsteps quickening as the tension in the air thickened. Hey! Miguel's voice rang out, firm and commanding, cutting through the men's threats. The assailants turned to face him, their expressions shifting from surprise to amusement as they sized up the lone figure who had dared to intervene. Well, looks like we've got a hero here, one of the men sneered, stepping forward with his knife raised. You sure you want to get involved, kid? This ain't your business. Miguel's heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to back down. Leave him alone, he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. There's no need for this. The leader of the group laughed, a harsh, grating sound that sent chills down Miguel's spine. Tough guy, huh? Let's see how tough you are. What happened next was something Miguel would later struggle to explain. As the first man lunged at him with a knife, Miguel's body moved on its own, reacting faster than his mind could comprehend. He sidestepped the attack with a fluid grace he didn't know he possessed, his hands lashing out with a speed and force that took even him by surprise. His fist connected with the man's jaw, sending him sprawling to the ground, unconscious before he hit the pavement. The other three attackers hesitated, momentarily stunned by the ease with which Miguel had dispatched their leader. But their hesitation was brief, and soon they too were charging at him, knives flashing in the dim light. But Miguel was ready. He met them head-on, his movements precise and powerful. Each punch, each strike, was delivered with a force that belied his slender frame. It was as if his body had been trained for this very moment, every muscle and reflex honed to perfection. In a matter of seconds, it was over. The four men lay unconscious at Miguel's feet, their weapons scattered across the ground. Miguel stood over them, breathing heavily, his mind racing to catch up with what had just happened. He had never fought like that before, never even thrown a punch in anger, and yet he had taken down four armed men with a skill and efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. As the adrenaline began to fade, Miguel's mind cleared, and he realized that the elderly man was still standing a few feet away, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "Thank you," the man stammered, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you. You saved my life." Miguel opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, a voice, loud, clear, and impossibly resonant, filled the air around him. "From this day forward, you are my warrior." The words echoed in his ears, vibrating through his very soul. Miguel spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but there was no one there. The street was deserted, save for him and the old man. His heart raced, and a chill ran down his spine as he tried to make sense of what he had just heard. "What? Who said that?" Miguel's voice trembled as he looked around frantically, his eyes scanning the darkened alley for any sign of another person. But there was no one, no shadowy figure lurking in the corners, no stranger hiding in the darkness. Just him and the old man and the quiet of the night. The elderly man, still catching his breath, noticed Miguel's confusion. "Is something wrong, son?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Miguel shook his head, trying to steady his thoughts. I heard something," he said slowly, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "Someone spoke to me, but there's no one here." The old man looked around, his expression puzzled. "I didn't hear anything. Maybe it was just the wind." But Miguel knew it was more than that. The voice had been too real, too powerful to be just a figment of his imagination. It had spoken to him, directly to his soul, with a command that he couldn't ignore. Before he could dwell on it any further, the old man's voice broke through his thoughts. "Son, I've been around a long time, and I've seen my fair share of fighters. But what you just did, I've never seen anything like it. Not even in the ring." Miguel blinked, his mind still reeling from the events of the last few minutes. "I don't know what happened. I just reacted." The old man stepped closer, his keen eyes studying Miguel intently. He took in the young man's height, the breadth of his shoulders, the strength in his hands that were rough and calloused from years of hard labor. There was something about Miguel that intrigued him, something that went beyond mere physicality. "You've got talent, son," the old man said after a moment, his voice thoughtful. "Real talent. You got the build of a fighter, And from what I just saw, you got the instincts of one too. You ever thought about boxing? Miguel shook his head, the idea seeming almost absurd to him. I'm just a laborer, he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. I work odd jobs to survive. I'm no fighter. The old man's expression softened as he saw the uncertainty in Miguel's eyes. Maybe not now, he said gently, but you could be. You've got something special, something most people spend their whole lives trying to find. And with the right training, who knows what you could become? Miguel remained silent, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. The idea of becoming a boxer seemed so far removed from the life he knew, a life of struggle and survival, of scraping by just to make it through another day. But something about the old man's words resonated with him, stirring a feeling deep within his chest that he couldn't quite ignore. I don't know, Miguel began, but the old man cut him off. Listen, the old man said, his voice taking on a firmer tone. I run a boxing gym not too far from here. It's nothing fancy, but it's got everything you need to train. I'm offering you a chance, son. A chance to learn, to see what you're capable of. You come by tomorrow, and we'll get started. You can stay at the gym if you need a place to sleep. It's better than living on the streets, and who knows? Maybe you'll find something you didn't even know you were looking for. Miguel hesitated, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. The offer was tempting, far more tempting than he wanted to admit. He had spent so long just trying to survive that the idea of doing something more, of becoming something more, seemed almost impossible. But as he looked into the old man's eyes, he saw something there, a belief, a conviction that maybe, just maybe, there was more to him than he had ever realized. After a long moment, Miguel finally nodded. Okay, he said quietly. I'll give it a try. The old man's face broke into a wide smile, his eyes twinkling with a mixture of relief and excitement. Good, he said, clapping Miguel on the shoulder. You won't regret it. My name's Don Hector, by the way. Miguel, the young man replied, shaking Don Hector's hand. As Miguel turned to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken a sharp turn, one that he had never anticipated, but one that felt strangely right. The voice he had heard still echoed in his mind, a constant reminder that there was something more at play here, something bigger than himself. That night, as he lay on his old, warm mattress, Miguel's thoughts were a whirlwind of uncertainty and hope. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of excitement, a sense of anticipation that made his heart race. There was something waiting for him, something just beyond the horizon, and he was ready to chase after it with everything he had. As sleep finally claimed him, Miguel dreamed of the ring, of a place where strength, skill, and determination could change the course of a man's life. And deep down, he knew that his journey had only just begun. Part 2. The Awakening. The first light of dawn was barely creeping over the skyline of Los Angeles when Miguel made his way to Don Hector's gym. The city was still waking up, the streets quieter than usual, with only the early risers and those with nowhere else to go milling about. Miguel's steps were steady, but his heart was racing with a mixture of anticipation and nerves. He had barely slept the night before, his mind too full of questions and doubts. Could he really do this? Was he truly cut out to be a fighter? When he arrived, Miguel stood outside the gym for a moment, taking it all in. The building was old, its brick facade weathered by time and the elements. A faded sign above the entrance bore the name Hector's Gym, the letters barely legible from years of neglect. But despite its worn exterior, there was a certain charm to the place, a sense of history that seemed to seep from the very walls. It was as if the gym had seen countless fighters pass through its doors, each one leaving a piece of their story behind. With a deep breath, Miguel pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. The scent of sweat, leather, and metal filled the air, a potent mix that spoke of hard work and determination. The interior was just as worn as the exterior. Cracked mirrors lined the walls, and the equipment looked like it had been there for decades. But everything was functional, and there was a certain beauty in its ruggedness. Don Hector was already there, standing in the middle of the gym, his arms crossed as he watched Miguel enter. The old man's face broke into a smile when he saw him. "You made it," he said, his voice warm and welcoming. "I wasn't sure if you'd show up." Miguel nodded, trying to suppress the nervous energy buzzing in his veins. "I said I would," he replied, his voice steady but soft. "Good," Don Hector said, clapping his hands together. "Let's get started. There's a lot to learn, and you've got a long road ahead of you." The first few days were a whirlwind. Don Hector wasted no time in putting Miguel through his paces, starting with the basics. He taught him how to wrap his hands properly, how to stand, how to throw a punch. The movements felt awkward at first, but Miguel picked them up quickly, his body adapting to the new demands with surprising ease. There was something almost instinctual about it, as if his muscles were remembering something they had never been taught. As the days turned into weeks, Miguel began to settle into a routine. He would arrive at the gym early in the morning, just as the sun was rising, and train until his body could take no more. Don Hector was a strict but fair teacher, pushing Miguel to his limits while also knowing when to ease off. He was patient, correcting Miguel's form, showing him how to move with the grace of a seasoned fighter. Miguel soaked it all in, eager to learn, driven by a fire that burned brighter with each passing day. The gym became a second home to Miguel, a place where he could escape the harsh realities of his life. There, surrounded by the sounds of fists hitting heavy bags and the rhythmic thumping of speed bags, he found a sense of peace he had never known before. The physical exertion, the discipline, the focus, it all brought him a clarity of mind that was as exhilarating as it was calming. Every punch, every movement felt like a step closer to something greater, something he had never dared to dream of. But the training wasn't just physical. Don Hector made sure to instill in Miguel the mental and emotional aspects of boxing as well. Boxing isn't just about strength, he would say during their sessions. It's about strategy, discipline, and most importantly, heart. You can have all the power in the world, but if you don't have the will to win, you'll never make it. Miguel took those words to heart. He found himself thinking about them long after the training sessions were over, reflecting on his life and the struggles he had faced. He realized that boxing wasn't just about fighting, it was about perseverance, about getting up every time life knocked you down. It was about facing your fears, your doubts, and your pain, and choosing to keep going, no matter how hard it got. One evening, after an especially grueling training session, Don Hector pulled Miguel aside. The gym was quiet, the other fighters having already left for the day, and the two of them stood alone in the fading light. "You've got something special, Miguel," Don Hector said, his voice serious but filled with a kind of pride that Miguel wasn't used to hearing. "I've trained a lot of fighters in my time, but none of them have picked it up as fast as you. It's like you were born for this." Miguel looked down at his hands, which were still wrapped in the familiar bandages. They were trembling slightly from the exertion, the skin beneath raw and blistered. "It just feels right," he admitted, his voice quiet. "Like I'm doing what I was always meant to do." Don Hector nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "There's more to boxing than just throwing punches, Miguel. It's about who you are, deep down, what you stand for, what you believe in, and I think you're starting to figure that out." Miguel didn't respond right away. He thought back to the night of the assault, to the voice he had heard. It still echoed in his mind, a constant reminder that there was something more to this, something he couldn't quite grasp. "Do you believe in destiny, Don Hector?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The old man raised an eyebrow, surprised by the question. "Destiny? I've seen a lot in my time, Miguel. I don't know if I'd call it destiny, but I do believe that some people are meant for more than they realize. Maybe you're one of those people." Miguel nodded slowly, the words resonating with him in a way he hadn't expected. "I heard a voice that night. After I fought those guys," he confessed, his voice trembling slightly. "It said, 'From this day forward, you are my warrior.' I can't stop thinking about it." Don Hector's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't dismiss the idea. Instead, he simply said, "Maybe you were meant to be here, to do something great. But whatever it is, it's up to you to figure it out. Just know that I'm here to help you every step of the way." Miguel felt a surge of gratitude towards Don Hector, a man who had taken a chance on him when no one else had. He had given Miguel more than just a place to train. He had given him hope, a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for so long. For the first time in years, Miguel felt like he was on the right path, like he was finally moving towards something meaningful, something that could change not only his life, but the lives of those around him. As the weeks passed, Miguel's reputation began to grow. Word spread about the young man training at Don Hector's gym, and soon, others started to take notice. They watched in awe as Miguel's skills developed, his punches gaining power and precision with each passing day. There was a quiet intensity about him, a focus that drew people in and made them believe in his potential. But despite the attention, Miguel remained humble, always focused on the task at hand. He knew that this was just the beginning and that the real test was yet to come. And then, one day, the opportunity they had been waiting for arrived, a chance for Miguel to step into the ring as a professional fighter. The opponent was no easy mark, an undefeated fighter with 20 wins, all by knockout. The challenge was immense, but Miguel felt no fear. Instead, he felt a calm determination, a quiet confidence that came from a place deep within. The night before the fight, as he lay in his bed at the gym, Miguel found himself praying for the first time in years. "Lord," he whispered into the darkness, "I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, but I'm putting my trust in you. Guide my steps and give me the strength to face whatever comes my way." As he drifted off to sleep, Miguel felt a peace settle over him, as if the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, but for now, he was content, knowing that he was not alone in this journey. Part 3. The First Battle. The day of the fight dawned bright and clear, the California sun shining down on the city with a warmth that belied the tension simmering just beneath the surface. For weeks, the upcoming match had been the talk of the town, a clash between an undefeated champion and an unknown underdog, a fight that promised to be one for the history books. The anticipation was palpable, the excitement building with each passing hour as the city braced itself for the showdown. Miguel awoke that morning with a mixture of emotions swirling inside him. He had trained tirelessly for this moment, pushing his body and mind to their limits under Don Hector's watchful eye. Every muscle in his body ached with the memory of countless hours spent in the gym, but there was no room for doubt or hesitation now. The time had come to prove himself, to step into the ring and face an opponent who had never known defeat. The arena was already buzzing with activity by the time Miguel arrived, the air thick with the scent of sweat and anticipation. The noise of the crowd, a low hum of conversation and excitement, washed over him as he made his way through the halls. Posters of the fighters adorned the walls, their faces staring down with an intensity that mirrored the atmosphere of the day. Backstage, the tension was almost tangible. Miguel could feel it in the air, in the way people moved with a certain urgency, their faces etched with a mixture of nerves and determination. He had never been in a place like this before, where the stakes were so high, where every moment was charged with the potential for triumph or disaster. It was overwhelming, but at the same time, it fueled the fire that had been burning within him since the day he first stepped into Don Hector's gym. As he prepared in the locker room, Miguel went through the familiar motions, wrapping his hands with practiced precision, slipping into his gloves, adjusting his gear. Each movement was deliberate, almost ritualistic, a way to steady his nerves and focus his mind on the task ahead. Don Hector was there with him, his presence a comforting anchor in the storm of emotions swirling inside Miguel. "You've got this, Miguel," Don Hector said, his voice steady and calm. "You've put in the work, and you're ready. Remember what we've talked about. Stay focused, keep your guard up, and don't let him get into your head." Miguel nodded, his jaw clenched in determination. "I know, Hector. I'm ready." But despite his words, there was a part of Miguel that couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. This was his first professional fight, and it wasn't just any fight. It was against a man who had built his career on knocking out anyone who dared to stand in his way. The pressure was immense, and the fear of failure loomed large in the back of Miguel's mind. But he pushed it aside, focusing instead on the faith that had carried him this far. As the minutes ticked by, the noise from the arena grew louder, a steady roar that filled the corridors and seeped into every corner of the building. Miguel could feel the vibrations beneath his feet, the energy of the crowd feeding into the adrenaline that pumped through his veins. This was it, the moment of truth. When the time finally came, Miguel stepped out of the locker room, his heart pounding in his chest. The hallway leading to the ring was lined with people, trainers, officials, reporters, all watching him with a mix of curiosity and expectation. He could see the path ahead, the bright lights of the arena beckoning him forward, and he walked towards them with steady, measured steps. The arena erupted in cheers as he emerged from the tunnel, the sound hitting him like a wave. Thousands of eyes were on him, watching his every move, judging him before he had even thrown a punch. It was both exhilarating and terrifying, the sheer magnitude of the moment threatening to overwhelm him. But Miguel kept his focus, his gaze locked on the ring in the center of the arena. That was where he needed to be, where everything else would fade away, leaving only him and his opponent. The ring was a world unto itself, a square of canvas surrounded by ropes and lights, where the only thing that mattered was the fight. Miguel climbed through the ropes, his body tensing as he took in the sight of his opponent on the other side. The man was every bit as imposing as his reputation suggested, tall, muscular, with a cold, calculating gaze that seemed to pierce through everything it touched. He was the embodiment of intimidation, a fighter who had never tasted defeat and had no intention of starting now. As the referee went over the rules, Miguel kept his eyes on his opponent, studying every detail, every movement. The man's confidence was palpable, a smugness that came from knowing he was the favorite, the one everyone expected to win. But Miguel wasn't here to fulfill those expectations. He was here to defy them. When the bell rang, signaling the start of the first round, the noise of the crowd seemed to fade into the background. Miguel's world narrowed to the man in front of him, to the movements of his body, the rhythm of his breathing. The first few moments were a blur of motion, both fighters testing the waters, throwing jabs and feints, trying to gauge each other's strengths and weaknesses. But it didn't take long for Miguel to realize that this was going to be harder than anything he had ever faced. His opponent was fast, faster than anyone he had sparred with in training, and his punches came with a force that shook Miguel to his core. The first round was a struggle, Miguel's movements stiff and uncoordinated as he tried to find his rhythm. He could feel the pressure mounting with each passing second, the weight of the crowd's expectations bearing down on him. By the time the first round ended, Miguel was already breathing hard, his body aching from the barrage of punches he had endured. He retreated to his corner, where Don Hector was waiting with a look of concern on his face. "You're better than this, Miguel," Don Hector said, his voice firm but encouraging. "You've trained for this. You just need to find your focus. Don't let the crowd or the pressure get to you. Remember why you're here." Miguel nodded, but the doubts lingered. He could feel the fear creeping in, the worry that he wasn't cut out for this, that he had bitten off more than he could chew. But as the bell rang for the second round, something inside him shifted. It was as if a switch had been flipped, a surge of energy and determination flooding through his veins. This time, when he stepped back into the ring, Miguel moved with a newfound confidence. His body felt lighter, his movements more fluid as he dodged and countered his opponent's attacks. He could see the frustration building in the man's eyes, the realization that Miguel wasn't going to go down as easily as he had thought. The fight became a battle of wills, both men pushing each other to their limits. Miguel could feel the exhaustion setting in, the ache in his muscles growing with each punch, but he refused to give in. He drew on every ounce of strength he had, every lesson he had learned in the gym, every moment of doubt and fear that had brought him to this point. And then in the third round, it happened. Miguel saw an opening, a brief moment of vulnerability in his opponent's stance. Without hesitation, he seized the opportunity, delivering a powerful right hook that connected with the man's jaw. The impact was immediate, the force of the blow sending his opponent crashing to the canvas. For a split second, the entire arena fell silent, the shock of what had just happened rippling through the crowd. And then, as the referee began the count, the noise returned with a vengeance, a deafening roar of disbelief and excitement. Miguel had done it. He had knocked out the undefeated champion. As the referee reached 10 and declared the fight over, Miguel stood in the center of the ring, his chest heaving with exertion, his mind struggling to process what he had just accomplished. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. He had won. He had defied the odds, silenced the doubters, and proved to himself and everyone else that he was more than just an underdog. The referee raised his hand in victory, and the crowd erupted once more, their cheers and applause washing over Miguel like a tidal wave. But even in that moment of triumph, Miguel knew that this victory wasn't his alone. It belonged to Don Hector, who had believed in him when no one else did. It belonged to the voice that had spoken to him that fateful night, guiding him down a path he had never imagined for himself. And most of all, it belonged to the faith that had carried him through every challenge, every doubt, and every fear. As he looked out at the sea of faces, at the people cheering his name, Miguel felt a sense of peace and fulfillment that he had never known before. This was just the beginning. There were more battles to fight, more mountains to climb. But for now, in this moment, he allowed himself to savor the victory, to bask in the knowledge that he had earned it through hard work, determination, and an unwavering belief in something greater than himself. Later that night, long after the arena had emptied and the adrenaline had worn off, Miguel found himself standing in front of a small church on the outskirts of the city. The lights inside were dim, casting a warm, golden glow through the stained glass windows. Without really knowing why, Miguel felt drawn to the place, as if something was calling him inside. He stepped through the heavy wooden doors, the quiet of the church enveloping him like a comforting embrace. The air was thick with the scent of incense, the flickering candles casting dancing shadows on the walls. Miguel walked down the aisle, his footsteps echoing softly in the stillness, until he reached the altar at the front of the church. For a moment, he simply stood there, taking in the sight of the cross that hung above the altar, its simple, yet powerful presence filling him with a sense of awe. And then, slowly, he sank to his knees, his hands clasped in front of him as he bowed his head in prayer. "Lord," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know what the future holds, but I know that you've guided me here for a reason. I give this victory to you, and I dedicate my life to serving you from this day forward." Tears filled his eyes as he spoke, his heart swelling with gratitude and love. For the first time in his life, Miguel felt truly at peace, knowing that he was walking the path that had been laid out for him. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, more battles to fight, but he also knew that he wasn't facing them alone. With God by his side, Miguel was ready for whatever the future held. Part 4. The Final Test. The sun was just beginning to rise over the rugged peaks of the Sierra Nevada mountains, casting a golden hue over the landscape. The air was crisp and cool, a welcome contrast to the heat of the Los Angeles streets where Miguel had spent so much of his life. Here, in the solitude of the mountains, the world felt different, slower, quieter, and more focused. It was the perfect place for the final stage of his training, a place where he could strip away the distractions of the outside world and hone his body and mind for the greatest challenge he had ever faced. Don Hector had chosen this place with care, knowing that the isolation would push Miguel to his limits in ways that the city never could. The camp was simple, almost Spartan, with just the bare necessities for living and training. A small wooden cabin served as their home, its rough-hewn walls and sparse furnishings a far cry from the comforts of modern life. The training area was equally basic, a makeshift gym set up in a clearing, with a heavy bag hanging from a tree branch, a speed bag attached to a wooden post, and a simple ring marked out on the ground with rope and stakes. For Miguel, the camp represented more than just a physical challenge. It was a test of his resolve, a chance to confront the doubts and fears that still lingered in the back of his mind. The upcoming fight was unlike anything he had ever faced, a title match against the reigning middleweight champion, a man whose reputation for brutality and arrogance was matched only by his skill in the ring. The champion was known for his ruthless tactics, both in and out of the ring, and he had made it clear that he had no respect for Miguel or the faith that drove him. But Miguel wasn't here to earn the champion's respect. He was here to prepare himself, to ensure that when the time came, he would be ready to face the man who stood between him and the title. And so, with Don Hector by his side, he threw himself into the training with a single-minded determination that bordered on obsession. The days at the camp followed a strict routine, each one blending into the next with a relentless rhythm. Miguel would rise before dawn, the cold mountain air biting at his skin as he laced up his running shoes and set off on a grueling run through the rocky terrain. The path was steep and unforgiving, the altitude making every breath a struggle, but Miguel pushed through the discomfort, his legs burning with the effort. This was just the beginning. After the run, he would return to the clearing, where Don Hector would be waiting to put him through his paces. The training sessions were intense, a brutal mix of strength and conditioning exercises designed to build Miguel's endurance and power. He would spend hours pounding the heavy bag, his fists hammering into the leather with a force that seemed to grow with each passing day. The speed bag became a blur under his relentless assault, his hands moving with a precision and speed that even Don Hector hadn't expected. But it wasn't just about building strength. Don Hector knew that Miguel's greatest weapon in the upcoming fight would be his mind, and he worked just as hard to sharpen Miguel's mental focus as he did his physical prowess. Between training sessions, they would sit together in the shade of the trees, Don Hector guiding Miguel through visualization exercises, helping him to see the fight in his mind's eye, to anticipate every move, every punch, every counter. Boxing is as much a mental game as it is a physical one, Don Hector would say, his voice calm and steady. The moment you let doubt creep in, you've already lost. You have to believe in yourself, in your training, and in the strength that comes from your faith. That's what will carry you through when things get tough. Miguel took those words to heart, carrying them with him through every grueling session, every moment of doubt. He would spend hours alone in the cabin at night, going over the fight in his mind, imagining every possible scenario, every way his opponent might try to break him down. And each time, he would picture himself standing tall, weathering the storm, and coming out on top. It wasn't just about winning the fight. It was about proving to himself that he was worthy of the faith that had been placed in him. The training wasn't without its challenges. The isolation of the mountains, while effective in stripping away distractions, also brought with it a loneliness that Miguel hadn't anticipated. There were days when the silence was almost oppressive, when the only sounds were the rustling of the trees and the distant call of a bird. On those days, the weight of what lay ahead would press down on him, the fear of failure gnawing at the edges of his mind. But whenever the doubts threatened to overwhelm him, Miguel would remember why he was here. He would think back to that voice, the one that had spoken to him in the alley all those months ago, the one that had called him a warrior. That memory, coupled with the unwavering support of Don Hector, gave him the strength to keep going, to push through the pain and the fatigue, to keep his eyes fixed on the goal. As the weeks passed, Miguel could feel himself growing stronger, not just physically, but mentally and spiritually as well. He could see the changes in his body, the way his muscles had grown more defined, the way his reflexes had sharpened. But more than that, he could feel the changes within himself, the calm confidence that had taken root, the deep sense of purpose that had become his guiding light. One evening, after a particularly intense sparring session, Miguel and Don Hector sat together by a small fire outside the cabin. The sun had set, and the sky above was a canvas of stars, their light flickering down like distant beacons. The air was cool, but the warmth of the fire kept the chill at bay, and the crackling of the flames provided a soothing backdrop to their conversation. "You've come a long way, Miguel," Don Hector said, his voice filled with a quiet pride. "I've seen you grow into a fighter that any man would be proud to face in the ring. But more than that, I've seen you grow into the man you were always meant to be." Miguel stared into the flames, his thoughts swirling with the weight of Don Hector's words. "It's been hard," he admitted, his voice low. "There were times when I didn't think I could do it, when I wanted to give up. That's what makes you different," Don Hector replied, his gaze steady. "You didn't give up. You kept going, even when it hurt, even when you were scared. That's what it means to be a warrior, Miguel. It's not about never feeling fear. It's about facing that fear head-on and refusing to let it control you." Miguel nodded, the truth of Don Hector's words sinking in. "I just hope I'm ready," he said quietly, the uncertainty in his voice betraying the confidence he had worked so hard to build. Don Hector reached over and placed a hand on Miguel's shoulder, his grip firm. "You are ready," he said, his voice filled with conviction. You've trained harder than anyone I've ever seen, and you've done it with a strength that comes from more than just your body. You've got the heart, the mind, and the spirit of a true champion. And when you step into that ring, you're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for something bigger. Miguel looked up at the stars, the vastness of the universe stretching out above him, and felt a sense of peace settle over him. He knew that Don Hector was right. This fight wasn't just about a title. It was about proving that he was more than the sum of his past, that he was capable of greatness, that he could stand tall in the face of adversity and emerge victorious. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, Miguel made a silent vow to himself. He would give everything he had in that ring, not just for the title, but for the man who had believed in him when no one else did, for the voice that had called him a warrior, and for the faith that had carried him through the darkest moments of his life. The morning of the fight arrived with a sense of inevitability. The sky was clear, the air crisp, as if the world itself was holding its breath in anticipation. Miguel's body thrummed with a nervous energy as he prepared for the journey back to the city, where the fight would take place. Don Hector was by his side, offering quiet words of encouragement as they packed up the cabin and loaded the car. The drive back to Los Angeles was long and silent, the city slowly coming into view as the mountains receded into the distance. Miguel's thoughts were a whirlwind, his mind racing with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. But as they neared the city, a strange calm began to settle over him, a sense of clarity that seemed to sharpen his focus and steady his nerves. When they arrived at the arena, the atmosphere was electric. The noise of the crowd, the bright lights, the buzz of excitement, it all hit Miguel like a tidal wave. But instead of being overwhelmed, he felt a surge of energy, a deep resolve that had been forged in the fires of his training. This was it, the final test. As he stepped into the locker room to prepare, Miguel went through the familiar rituals with a sense of purpose. Every movement was deliberate, every thought focused on the task ahead. Don Hector was there, a steady presence by his side, offering last-minute advice and reassurance. But Miguel knew that when he stepped into that ring, he would be on his own, relying on the strength and skill he had spent months honing. The weigh-in and press conference had been tense affairs, with the champion doing everything in his power to unnerve Miguel. He had taunted and provoked, trying to get under Miguel's skin to shake his confidence. But Miguel had remained calm, refusing to rise to the bait, knowing that his true battle would be fought in the ring. And now, as the final moments ticked away, Miguel could feel the weight of everything that had brought him to this point. The years of struggle, the doubts and fears, the countless hours of training, all of it had led to this. He was ready, he was strong, and most importantly, he wasn't alone. As he stood in the hallway, waiting for the call to step into the arena, Miguel closed his eyes and whispered a final prayer. "Father, I leave this in your hands. I know you have a plan for me, and I trust in your will. Whatever happens tonight, I will give you all the glory." The doors to the arena opened, and the roar of the crowd filled the air, a deafening wave of sound that washed over Miguel as he stepped into the light. The time had come. The final test awaited, and Miguel was ready to face it head-on, with the heart of a warrior and the strength of his faith to guide him. Part 5. God Transforms. The night sky over Las Vegas was ablaze with lights, the city's neon signs flickering like stars in a man-made constellation. The streets buzzed with life, the air filled with the sound of music, laughter, and the distant hum of slot machines. But in one corner of this sprawling city, the focus was on something far removed from the glitz and glamour of the casinos. Inside a massive stadium, thousands of fans had gathered, their attention fixed on the ring where the fight of the century was about to take place. Miguel stood in the tunnel leading to the arena, his heart pounding in his chest. The roar of the crowd was a distant murmur, muffled by the walls around him, but he could feel the energy, the anticipation that radiated from the packed stadium. This was the moment he had been working towards for so long, the culmination of months of grueling training, of pushing himself beyond his limits. The fight for the middleweight championship of the world. The final moments before stepping into the ring were always the hardest. The weight of what lay ahead pressed down on him, the enormity of the task before him threatening to overwhelm his resolve. But as he took a deep breath, Miguel felt a familiar sense of calm wash over him. The same peace that had carried him through every challenge he had faced since that fateful night in Los Angeles. He knew that he wasn't alone in this fight, that there was a strength within him that came from a source far greater than himself. As the announcer called his name, Miguel stepped out of the tunnel and into the blinding lights of the arena. The noise hit him like a wall, a deafening roar of cheers and shouts that reverberated through the stadium. But Miguel's focus was unwavering. He kept his eyes fixed on the ring, his mind locked on the task at hand. This was his moment, and he was ready. The champion was already in the ring, his presence as imposing as ever. The man was a mountain of muscle, his body honed to perfection through years of training and countless victories. He wore a look of confidence, almost bordering on arrogance, his eyes cold and calculating as they locked onto Miguel. To him, this was just another fight, another opponent to crush under the weight of his fists. He had no respect for Miguel, no regard for the journey that had brought him here. But Miguel didn't need his respect. He wasn't here to earn the approval of his opponent or the adulation of the crowd. He was here for something much greater, something that went beyond titles and accolades. As he climbed into the ring, Miguel felt a surge of determination, a fire that burned deep within his soul. This was more than a fight. It was a testament to his faith, a chance to show the world the power of belief, of perseverance, and of the human spirit. The referee went over the rules, his voice barely audible over the roar of the crowd. Miguel nodded along, his mind already replaying the strategies he and Don Hector had drilled into him over the past 3 months. He knew what he had to do. Stay focused. Keep his guard up. Don't let the champion dictate the pace of the fight. It was simple in theory, but in practice, it would require every ounce of strength, skill, and willpower he possessed. When the bell rang to start the first round, the crowd's noise reached a fever pitch. The two fighters met in the center of the ring, their eyes locked in a silent battle of wills. The champion struck first, his jab quick and powerful, a test of Miguel's defenses. Miguel blocked the punch with ease, his movements smooth and controlled. He could see the champion's intentions in his eyes, the way he studied Miguel, looking for weaknesses, for openings. But Miguel wasn't going to give him any. The first few rounds were a blur of motion and sound, both fighters feeling each other out, testing the waters. The champion was as strong and skilled as his reputation suggested, his punches landing with a force that rattled Miguel's bones. But Miguel held his ground, his defense solid, his counters sharp. He moved with a grace that belied his size, his footwork light and precise as he danced around the ring, avoiding the champion's heavier blows. As the fight wore on, the champion grew more aggressive, his frustration evident in the way he began to press the attack. He threw combination after combination, each one designed to break through Miguel's defenses, to wear him down. But Miguel absorbed the blows, his body toughened by months of training, his mind focused on the strategies he had practiced over and over again. He could feel the fatigue setting in, the ache in his muscles growing with each punch, but he refused to let it slow him down. This was what he had trained for, what he had prepared for, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. By the 9th round, both fighters were showing signs of wear. The champion's attacks had become more reckless, his punches wild and unfocused as he tried to land the knockout blow. Miguel, on the other hand, had settled into a rhythm, his movements calculated, his punches precise. He was playing the long game, wearing the champion down, waiting for the moment when he could strike. And then in the 10th round, that moment came. As the bell rang, signaling the start of the round, Miguel felt a surge of energy, a second wind that seemed to come from nowhere. The champion came at him with a flurry of punches, desperate to end the fight, but Miguel saw the openings, the weaknesses in his opponent's attacks. He dodged a wild right hook, ducking under the champion's arm, and countered with a powerful left jab that snapped the man's head back. The crowd roared in approval, the noise almost deafening as they sensed the shift in momentum. Miguel pressed the attack, his punches coming faster, harder. He could see the fatigue in the champion's eyes, the way his movements had slowed, his reactions dulled by exhaustion. This was his chance. Miguel feinted to the left, drawing the champion's guard down, and then delivered a devastating right hook that connected with the man's jaw with a sickening thud. The champion staggered, his legs wobbling as he tried to stay on his feet. But Miguel wasn't done. He stepped in, delivering a rapid combination of punches to the body and head, each one landing with precision and power. The crowd was on its feet, the noise reaching a crescendo as Miguel unleashed a final, thunderous uppercut that lifted the champion off his feet and sent him crashing to the canvas. For a moment, the entire stadium seemed to hold its breath, the world standing still as the referee began the count. Miguel stood in the center of the ring, his chest heaving, his fists clenched at his sides, his eyes locked on the fallen champion. He could barely hear the referee's voice over the roar of the crowd, but the numbers were clear. 1, 2, 3, for 5. When the count reached 10, the noise erupted like a volcano, the crowd's cheers shaking the very foundations of the stadium. Miguel had done it. He had knocked out the undefeated champion and claimed the middleweight title for himself. The referee raised his hand in victory, but Miguel's mind was elsewhere. He was thinking of all the people who had believed in him, who had supported him on this journey. Don Hector, his parents, the voice that had spoken to him on that night so long ago. As the belt was placed around his waist, Miguel looked up at the ceiling of the stadium, tears streaming down his face. He raised his fist to the sky, his voice trembling with emotion as he shouted, "This victory is for you, God. All honor and glory to you." The crowd continued to cheer, their voices blending into a cacophony of sound that filled every corner of the stadium. But Miguel's focus was elsewhere. In that moment, as he stood in the center of the ring, the championship belt around his waist, Miguel felt a deep sense of peace and fulfillment. He knew that this victory was not just his. It was a testament to the power of faith, to the strength that comes from believing in something greater than yourself. In the days and weeks that followed, Miguel's life changed in ways he could never have imagined. He became a household name, a symbol of hope and inspiration for millions of people around the world. But through it all, he remained humble, always remembering the journey that had brought him to this point. He used his newfound fame and fortune to give back to the community, investing in Don Hector's gym, helping other young men and women find their way in the world of boxing, just as he had. Miguel spoke openly about his faith, sharing his story with anyone who would listen. He traveled the country, speaking at schools, churches, and community centers, spreading a message of hope and perseverance. He wanted people to know that no matter how difficult life might seem, there was always a way forward, always a path to something greater. And that path, for him, had been paved with faith, hard work, and an unwavering belief in the power of God. Years later, when he looked back on his life, Miguel knew that the true victory wasn't the championship belt or the accolades. It was the transformation that had taken place within him, the journey that had led him from the streets of Los Angeles to the pinnacle of the boxing world. And he knew, without a doubt, that he had fulfilled his purpose as a warrior for God. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, God bless you.